The late afternoon sun filtered softly through the tall windows of the cliff house, casting long, golden streaks across the polished floors as Taylor stood silently near the doorway, her suitcase resting beside her like a quiet declaration of everything she had already decided. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that lingered after too many secrets, too many heartbreaks, and far too many second chances that never quite healed what was broken, and Deacon, standing just a few feet away, could feel it pressing down on his chest as he watched her, his mind racing with everything he wanted to say but couldn't quite form into words, because deep down he already knew this wasn't a moment he could fix with charm or persistence or even sincerity. This was something final, something inevitable, something that had been building for far longer than either of them had been willing to admit, and Taylor, composed yet visibly emotional, finally turned to face him, her eyes reflecting both strength and sorrow, the kind that comes from loving deeply but realizing that love alone isn't always enough to make something right. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence louder than any argument they had ever had, filled with memories of stolen glances, quiet confessions, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rewrite the story that had always seemed destined to fall apart. But now that hope felt distant, almost naive, and Deacon took a step closer, his voice softer than usual as he tried to reach her, asking if she was really going through with it, if she was really about to walk away from everything they had been trying to build, and Taylor inhaled slowly, steadying herself, knowing that if she let herself hesitate even for a second, she might not have the strength to leave at all, and that was something she couldn't risk anymore, not after everything that had happened. Not after the pain, the betrayals, the complicated entanglements that seemed to follow them no matter how hard they tried to escape, and she looked at him with a tenderness that made it all the more heartbreaking, because there was no anger in her expression, no resentment, just a quiet understanding that sometimes the right choice is also the hardest one. And then, with a calmness that felt almost surreal given the storm of emotions underneath, she finally spoke the 5 words that would change everything. "This isn't where I belong," and the simplicity of it struck Deacon harder than any accusation ever could, because it wasn't about blame, it wasn't about pointing fingers or revisiting past mistakes, it was about truth, a truth that neither of them could deny no matter how much they might want to, and he shook his head slightly, struggling to accept it, telling her that they could figure it out, that they had been through worse, that walking away didn't have to be the answer. But even as he spoke, there was a part of him that knew he was grasping at something that was already slipping through his fingers, and Taylor stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm, a gesture filled with warmth but also finality, and she explained that this wasn't about giving up. It was about choosing a path that didn't keep pulling them back into the same cycle of pain and confusion, a path that allowed both of them to find peace, even if it meant finding it apart. And Deacon's expression softened as he listened, the weight of her words settling in. And for a moment he considered arguing again, considered making another plea, but instead he just looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the certainty in her eyes, the quiet resolve that told him she had already made this decision long before this moment, and that there was nothing he could say that would change her mind. And that realization hurt more than he expected, because despite everything, despite all the complications and the history and the chaos that seemed to follow them, he had allowed himself to believe that this time might be different, that this time they might actually get it right. And now he had to face the possibility that some stories aren't meant to have the ending you hope for, and Taylor, sensing his internal struggle, offered him a small, bittersweet smile, telling him that what they had shared wasn't a mistake, that it had meant something, that it had helped her see parts of herself she had forgotten, and that she would always be grateful for that. But gratitude wasn't enough to build a future on, not when the foundation was already cracked, and Deacon exhaled slowly, the fight leaving him as he nodded, acknowledging her words even if he didn't fully accept them, and he told her that he understood, even though it felt like losing something he hadn't realized meant so much to him until now. And Taylor's eyes softened even more at that, because she knew exactly what he meant. She felt it too, that sense of loss, that quiet ache that comes with letting go of something that once felt so right. and yet she also knew that holding on would only prolong the inevitable, would only lead to more pain down the line, and she didn't want that for either of them. And so she picked up her suitcase, the small but significant action signaling that there was no turning back now, and Deacon stepped aside, giving her the space she needed even though every instinct in him was telling him to do the opposite, to pull her back, to ask her to stay, to promise that things could be different. But promises felt hollow in this moment, and he knew it, and as Taylor walked toward the door, she paused for just a second, glancing back at him one last time, her expression a mix of sadness and acceptance, and in that brief moment, everything that had been left unsaid seemed to pass between them, a silent acknowledgement of what they had been, what they had hoped to be, and what they ultimately could not become, and then she turned and walked out, leaving behind not just the house but the version of her life that had been tied to him, and Deacon stood there long after she was gone, the quiet of the room now almost deafening, replaying her 5 words over and over in his mind, realizing that sometimes the most powerful statements are the simplest ones, because they carry a truth that can't be argued with. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the room into shadow, he finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of it. The loss, the regret, the understanding, all of it blending together into something that would take time to process, time to heal from, and maybe, eventually, time to learn from. Because even though this chapter had ended in a way he hadn't wanted, it didn't mean it had been meaningless. And somewhere, beneath the pain, there was a quiet acknowledgement that Taylor had done what she believed was right, not just for herself, but for both of them, and that, perhaps, was something he could come to. Respect, even if it took him a while to truly accept it. The front door clicked shut with a soft but definitive sound that seemed to echo far louder in Deacon's mind than it should have, and for several long seconds he didn't move at all, as if the world itself had paused to mark the significance of what had just happened, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Taylor had stood only moments before, half expecting her to walk back in and say she had changed her mind, that those 5 words hadn't been the end, but just another turn in their complicated story. But deep down he knew better, because there had been something unmistakably final in her voice, something steady and resolved that couldn't be undone by impulse or regret, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he ran a hand through his hair and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, the tension in his chest giving way to a heavy, aching emptiness that settled in its place, and as he began to move through the room, each step felt unfamiliar, like he was walking through a version of his life that no longer quite fit, every corner of the house holding traces of Taylor's presence, subtle reminders of conversations, laughter, quiet moments that now felt distant despite having happened not so long ago, and he found himself stopping near the window where she had been standing earlier, looking out at the fading light, trying to make sense of everything she had said, everything she hadn't said, and most of all those 5 simple words that had carried so much meaning. This isn't where I belong. A statement that wasn't just about the house or even about him, but about something deeper, something internal that he was only beginning to understand. And as much as it hurt, there was a part of him that respected it, because for all his flaws, all his past mistakes, he recognized courage when he saw it, and it had taken courage for Taylor to walk away, to choose uncertainty over a situation that felt wrong in ways neither of them could fully fix, and that realization didn't ease the pain, but it gave it context, gave it a kind of clarity that made it harder to argue against. And yet, despite that understanding, the emotional weight of the moment continued to press down on him, bringing with it a flood of memories he couldn't seem to shut off, moments when things had felt simpler, when their connection had seemed like something worth fighting for, when the idea of building a future together hadn't felt so complicated, and he wondered, not for the first time, where exactly things had started to unravel, whether there had been a specific moment that set them on this path, or if it had been a gradual shift, a series of small cracks that eventually became impossible to ignore, and as he leaned against the wall, staring out into the distance, he couldn't help but question himself, question the choices he had made, the things he had said or left unsaid, wondering if there was anything he could have done differently that might have changed the outcome. But even as those thoughts surfaced, he knew they wouldn't lead anywhere productive, because the truth was that relationships like theirs weren't undone by a single mistake. They were shaped by layers of history, by patterns that were difficult to break, by circumstances that sometimes made even the strongest feelings feel fragile, and Taylor had seen that, had recognized it in a way he hadn't fully been willing to until now. And maybe that was part of why this hurt so much, because her decision forced him to confront realities he had been avoiding, forced him to see things from a perspective that didn't allow for easy solutions or comforting illusions. And as the room grew darker with the setting sun, he finally pushed himself to move again, walking toward the small table where a few of Taylor's things still remained, items she had either forgotten or chosen to leave behind, and he picked one up absent-mindedly, turning it over in his hands as if it might somehow hold answers. But of course it didn't. It was just an object, a silent reminder of someone who had been there and was now gone, and with a quiet sigh, he set it back down, realizing that holding on to these fragments wouldn't bring her back or change what had happened, and yet letting go of them felt just as difficult, because it meant accepting the finality of it all, accepting that this chapter of his life had come to an end whether he was ready for it or not. And as he made his way toward the door, almost on instinct, he paused with his hand on the handle, glancing back one last time at the space that had so quickly become a collection of memories instead of a shared present, and for a brief moment, he considered going after her, considered the possibility that maybe there was still time to say something, to do something, to change the course of events before it was truly too late. But that moment passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the quiet understanding that chasing after her now wouldn't change what she had already decided, wouldn't address the deeper reasons behind her choice, and so instead, he let his hand fall away from the door and stepped back, choosing, perhaps for the first time, not to act on impulse but to sit with the reality of the situation, to allow himself to feel it fully rather than trying to escape it, and in that stillness, there was a strange kind of clarity, a recognition that while this ending wasn't what he had wanted, it might be what was necessary, not just for Taylor, but for him as well, because sometimes losing something forces you to reevaluate everything, to take a closer look at who you are and who you want to be moving forward, and as difficult as that process might be, it also carried the potential for growth, for change, for a different kind of future that wasn't defined by the same patterns and mistakes. And though he wasn't ready to embrace that idea just yet, the seed of it had been planted, lingering quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when he might finally be ready to face it. And somewhere, miles away, Taylor was likely beginning that same process in her own way, stepping into the unknown with a mix of fear and determination, guided by the belief that she had made the right choice even if it didn't feel easy. And while their paths were now separate, the impact they had on each other would remain, shaping the decisions they made, the relationships they formed, the people they continued to become, and in time, perhaps they would both look back on this moment not just as an ending, but as a turning point, a necessary shift that allowed them to move forward in ways they couldn't have if they had stayed exactly where they were, bound by something that no longer truly fit. And for now, that would have to be enough, even if it didn't feel like it. Nights settled in slowly, almost deliberately, as if the world itself understood that rushing past this moment would be a disservice to everything that had just unfolded, and Deacon eventually sank onto the couch, the quiet of the cliff house wrapping around him in a way that felt both suffocating and strangely honest, because for once there were no distractions, no chaos, no outside voices pulling his attention in a dozen directions, just him and the undeniable truth of what Taylor had done and why she had done it. And the more he let himself sit with it, the more those 5 words began to take on layers he hadn't fully grasped at first. This isn't where I belong. Not a rejection of him entirely, not a dismissal of what they had shared, but something far more personal, a realization that her place in the world, emotionally, mentally, even spiritually, couldn't exist within the boundaries of what they had built together. And as much as that stung, it also forced him to confront something uncomfortable about himself, something he had spent years avoiding behind humor, deflection, and a stubborn refusal to look too closely at his own patterns. Because if Taylor didn't belong there, then what did that say about the life he had created, about the environment he had asked her to step into, about the version of himself he had presented as enough? And he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as those questions circled in his mind, not with the usual defensiveness he might have once had, but with a rare willingness to actually consider the answers, even if they weren't flattering, even if they forced him to acknowledge the ways he had contributed to the instability that had ultimately driven her away, and for a moment he thought about calling someone, anyone, just to break the silence, to fill the space with another voice, so he wouldn't have to sit alone with his thoughts. But he didn't, because something about this felt like it needed to be experienced fully, without interruption, without escape, and so he stayed there, letting the weight of it all settle, letting the emotions come in waves instead of trying to push them aside, and as difficult as that was, it also brought with it a kind of clarity he hadn't expected, a sense that this wasn't just about losing Taylor, it was about understanding why he had lost her, and what that meant for who he was moving forward. And across town, Taylor stood on a quiet overlook, her suitcase resting beside her once again as she gazed out at the city lights flickering in the distance, each one representing a life, a story, a path that someone had chosen or been pushed into, and for the first time since walking out that door, she allowed herself to fully feel the impact of what she had done, the finality of it settling in as a mix of relief and sadness that she knew would take time to fully process. Because leaving hadn't been easy, it hadn't been something she had done lightly or without doubt, but it had been necessary, and she reminded herself of that as she wrapped her arms around herself against the cool night air, grounding herself in the decision even as her heart ached with the loss of what might have been, and she thought about Deacon, about the look in his eyes when she had spoken those 5 words, about the way he had tried to understand even when it hurt, and that made it harder in some ways, because it would have been easier if things had ended in anger, in conflict, in something that created a clear line between right and wrong, but this had been something else entirely, something quieter and more complex, a recognition that 2 people could care about each other deeply and still not be right for each other in the way that truly mattered, and as she took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, she felt a small but steady sense of certainty begin to settle beneath the sadness, a reminder that choosing herself, choosing her own sense of belonging, wasn't something to feel guilty about even if it came at a cost. And back at the Cliff House, Deacon finally stood, moving toward the window once more as if drawn there by something he couldn't quite explain, and as he looked out into the darkness, he realized that this moment, this exact moment, was a crossroads, whether he wanted it to be or not, because he could either let this loss define him in the same way past failures had, falling back into old habits, old patterns, old ways of coping, that ultimately led nowhere, or he could do something different, something that honored what Taylor had seen, what she had believed he was capable of even if he hadn't fully believed it himself, and that idea lingered with him, unfamiliar but not unwelcome, like a possibility he hadn't considered seriously until now, and he let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly as he acknowledged that while he couldn't change what had already happened, he still had control over what came next, and that was something, maybe not everything, but enough to start with. And miles away, Taylor picked up her suitcase again, turning away from the overlook as she began to walk toward whatever came next, her step steady even if her heart was still catching up, and though neither of them knew exactly where their paths would lead from here, there was a quiet understanding that this ending, painful as it was, might also be the beginning of something neither of them could yet fully see. Something shaped not by what they had lost, but by what they had learned. And in that sense, those 5 simple words would continue to echo, not as a goodbye alone, but as a turning point that would define everything that followed.